You think you know your neighbors, don't you? That friendly wave in the hallway, the polite nod by the mailbox, maybe even small talk about the weather. But what if I told you that behind those familiar faces, behind those routine interactions, lies something so disturbing, so chilling, that it would shatter everything you believed about the person living just 20 feet away from you? My name is Sophia, and 8 years ago, I left my quiet village in Portugal to chase dreams in the concrete jungle of New York City. I thought I'd seen it all, the chaos, the beauty, the darkness that pulses through these streets. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what I discovered about my neighbor, the man who lived in apartment 4B, the man who never spoke above a whisper, the man whose secret would haunt me forever. Before we dive into this nightmare, I need you to do something for me. I need you to think about your own neighbors right now. Really think about them. Do you actually know who they are? What they do when they think no one is watching? Because after you hear what happened to me, you'll never look at them the same way again. And if this story resonates with you, if it makes your skin crawl the way it should, hit that like button. Better yet, if you want access to stories even darker than this one, stories I can only share with my most trusted community, become a channel member. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming. When I first moved to this pre-war building on the Upper West Side, everything seemed perfect. High ceilings, original hardwood floors, and neighbors who minded their own business. That last part felt like a luxury after years of living with roommates who treated privacy like a foreign concept. The building had 12 units spread across 6 floors, and I quickly learned the rhythms of my new home. Mrs. Chen from 2A always had her morning coffee at exactly 7:30. The couple in 3C argued every Tuesday like clockwork, their voices carrying through the thin walls with painful predictability. But apartment 4B, silence. Complete, absolute silence. At first I thought it was empty. For weeks, I never heard footsteps above my head, never caught a glimpse of anyone coming or going. No cooking smells, no television noise, no signs of life whatsoever. It wasn't until my 3rd month in the building that I finally saw him. A man in his late 50s, maybe early 60s, with salt and pepper hair and clothes that looked like they belonged in a different decade. He was standing by the mailboxes, completely still, just staring at the metal doors like they held the secrets of the universe. When I said hello, he turned toward me with the slowest, most deliberate movement I'd ever seen. His eyes, I'll never forget those eyes, were the palest blue I'd ever encountered, almost translucent, like looking into winter fog. He nodded once, a barely perceptible acknowledgement, and then he was gone, vanished back upstairs without a sound. That encounter should have been forgettable. A shy neighbor, nothing more. But something about it stuck with me, scratched at the back of my mind, like a splinter I couldn't remove. Maybe it was the way he moved, so careful, so controlled. Or maybe it was the way he looked at me, not with recognition or curiosity, but with something else entirely. Something that made my Portuguese grandmother's voice echo in my memory, warning me about people whose eyes held too many shadows. Over the following months, I started paying attention, really paying attention. And that's when I noticed the patterns that no one else seemed to see. The grocery deliveries that arrived only after midnight. The way he never used the elevator, always the stairs, his footsteps so light they were barely audible. The fact that his apartment lights never came on before 3 in the morning and were always off before sunrise. Comment below and tell me, have you ever had a neighbor who gave you weird vibes? Someone who just felt off in a way you couldn't explain? Because I'm about to tell you why trusting those instincts might be the most important thing you ever do. The first real sign that something was wrong came during a summer blackout. The entire building lost power around 9 p.m., and like good New Yorkers, most of us gathered in the lobby with candles and flashlights, sharing stories and making the best of the situation. Everyone was there, Mrs. Chen, the arguing couple from 3C, the college students from the 5th floor, even cranky Mr. Rodriguez from the basement apartment who usually avoided human contact like the plague. Everyone except the man from 4B. But here's the thing that still makes my blood run cold. His apartment wasn't dark. While the rest of the building sat in complete blackness, I could see a faint, flickering light moving back and forth behind his windows. Not the steady beam of a flashlight or the warm glow of candles. This was something else, something that cast strange shadows against his blinds, shadows that moved in ways that defied explanation. Mrs. Chen noticed it too. She grabbed my arm with her thin fingers and whispered in broken English, "That man, he different, always different." When I asked what she meant, she just shook her head and walked away, but not before making the sign of the cross. Something I'd never seen her do in all the months I'd known her. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the building, every settling sound felt amplified. And around 3 a.m., I heard something that made my Portuguese blood freeze in my veins. Footsteps in the hallway, but not normal footsteps. These were soft, deliberate, and they stopped right outside my door. For 10 minutes, I lay there in complete silence, afraid to breathe too loudly. The footsteps didn't move. Whoever was out there was just standing there, waiting, listening. When they finally moved away, they didn't head toward the stairs or the elevator. They went back to 4B, and I heard his door open and close with the faintest whisper of sound. The next morning, I found something that confirmed my worst fears. Scratched into the paint beside my doorframe, so small and faint that I almost missed it, was a single word in what looked like Portuguese. Observada. Watched. My hands were shaking as I traced the letters with my finger. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't my imagination running wild in a new city. Someone had marked my door. Someone who knew exactly where I was from. What language would terrify me most? Someone who wanted me to know that I was being observed, studied, hunted, and the only person in the building who moved like a ghost, who lived in the shadows, who had those pale, haunting eyes, was the man from apartment 4B. I want you to pause right here and think about this. Really think about it. How would you react if you found a message like that outside your door? Would you call the police? Would you confront the person you suspected? Or would you do what I did, convince yourself you were overreacting, that there had to be a logical explanation? Because let me tell you right now, dismissing your instincts when something feels wrong is the kind of mistake that can cost you everything. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in psychological torture. Nothing dramatic, nothing you could point to and say definitively was threatening. But the small things, the subtle things, started adding up like drops of poison in a well. My morning routine became a nightmare of hyper-awareness. Every time I left my apartment, I felt eyes on me. Every time I came home, I checked for new marks, new messages, new signs that my sanctuary had been violated. The man from 4B seemed to know my schedule better than I did. He'd appear in the lobby just as I was leaving for work, or I'd catch glimpses of him at his window when I returned from evening runs in Central Park. The worst part wasn't the watching. It was the way he watched. There was something clinical about it. Methodical, like I was a specimen being studied for some unspeakable experiment, and those pale eyes of his never showed emotion, never revealed intention. They were empty mirrors, reflecting nothing but cold calculation. My sleep became fitful, interrupted by sounds that might have been footsteps or might have been the building settling. Dreams filled with shadows and whispers in languages I didn't recognize. I started sleeping with a knife under my pillow. Not that it would have made much difference if my suspicions were correct, but it gave me some small sense of control in a situation that felt increasingly out of my hands. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday in October. I'd worked late at the marketing firm, where I was barely making enough to cover rent, and I was exhausted when I finally dragged myself up to the 4th floor. As I fumbled with my keys, I heard something that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. Crying. Someone was crying in apartment 4B, but it wasn't the man's voice. It was high, desperate, filled with a terror so profound it seemed to seep through the walls and into my bones. A woman's voice, speaking in what sounded like Spanish, begging for something I couldn't understand, but felt in my soul. The crying went on for hours. I pressed my ear to the wall that separated our apartments, trying to make out words, trying to understand what was happening just a few feet away from me. The woman's voice rose and fell in waves of desperation, punctuated by long periods of silence that were somehow even more terrifying than the crying itself. And through it all, I never heard the man's voice, not once. Just that clinical silence, that methodical presence that I'd come to associate with him. By sunrise, the crying had stopped. The silence returned, thick and oppressive as always, but something had fundamentally changed. I could no longer pretend this was about a shy neighbor or my overactive imagination. Someone was in trouble in that apartment, someone needed help, and I was the only one who seemed to know about it. I need to ask you something right now, and I need you to be honest with me in the comments. If you heard someone crying for help next door, would you investigate? Would you call the police? Or would you do what most people do? Convince yourself it's none of your business and try to forget what you heard. Because your answer to that question might determine whether you're the kind of person who saves lives or the kind who lets darkness flourish in silence. For those of you who want to hear stories like this before anyone else, stories that dive even deeper into the shadows of human nature, consider becoming a channel member. I promise you, the exclusives I share with my inner circle will change how you see the world around you forever. That morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. I couldn't focus on spreadsheets and marketing campaigns when someone's life might be in danger just 20 feet away from where I slept. Instead, I positioned myself by my peephole and waited. If the man from 4B left his apartment, I was going to find a way inside. I was going to discover what he was hiding, no matter the cost. Hours passed. The building came alive with its usual rhythms. Mrs. Chen heading out for groceries, the couple from 3C leaving for their respective jobs, the sound of elevators carrying people to their normal, safe, predictable lives. But apartment 4B remained silent as a tomb. It wasn't until nearly 2 in the afternoon that I heard his door open. I pressed my eye to the peephole and watched as he emerged, dressed in the same outdated clothes, moving with that same careful, controlled precision. He carried a black duffel bag that looked heavy, and his pale eyes swept the hallway like a predator, checking for threats before heading toward the stairs. This was my chance. My only chance. I waited until I heard the building's front door close. Then I slipped out of my apartment with tools I'd borrowed from the building's maintenance closet. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the screwdriver, but desperation gave me focus. The lock on his door was old, simple, and within minutes I was inside apartment 4B. The smell hit me first. Not decay or death like you might expect, but something clinical and chemical, like a hospital mixed with a laboratory. The apartment was spartanly furnished, a single chair facing the window, a small table, a cot that looked like it hadn't been slept in. But it was the walls that made my knees buckle and my vision blur with terror. Every surface was covered with photographs, hundreds of them, pictures of women, young, old, every ethnicity you could imagine, but all sharing the same expression of absolute soul-crushing fear. And in the corner of each photograph, written in tiny, precise handwriting, were notes, times, dates, locations, and details that made my stomach turn. Maria Santos, 23, disappeared October 15th, last seen leaving work. Elena Vasquez, 31, missing since July 2nd, family still searching. Catherine Murphy, 19, vanished after evening run in Central Park. The photographs weren't random. They were trophies, documentation of something so evil, so systematic, that my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. And there, in the center of the wall, like some grotesque centerpiece, was a photograph of me. taken through my bedroom window while I was sleeping. Underneath my picture in that same meticulous handwriting, Sofia Pereira, 28, Portuguese, ideal candidate, phase 1 complete. My legs gave out. I collapsed to the floor, my vision swimming with spots of black and white as the full horror of my situation crashed over me like a wave. This wasn't about a mysterious neighbor or strange noises in the night. This was about a predator who had been stalking me for months, studying my patterns, planning something unspeakable. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was the sound I heard as I knelt there on his floor, surrounded by evidence of unimaginable evil. The sound of his key turning in the lock. He was back. The front door of apartment 4B opened with a whisper, and those familiar, careful footsteps entered the hallway. I was trapped in a monster's lair with nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, and a growing certainty that I was about to become the next photograph on his wall of horrors. Time slowed to a crawl as I heard him moving through his apartment, those methodical footsteps growing closer to the main room where I crouched among his twisted collection. My mind raced through possibilities. The window was too high to jump from, the door was blocked by his presence, and screaming would only alert him to exactly where I was hiding. But then I remembered something my grandfather used to tell me back in Portugal. When cornered by a wolf, don't try to outrun it. Become something it doesn't expect. So instead of cowering, instead of waiting for him to discover me, I made a choice that would either save my life or end it immediately. I stood up and walked into the hallway to face him. The man from apartment 4B was standing by his door, still holding that heavy black duffel bag, those pale eyes fixed on me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not surprise, not anger, but something closer to disappointment. Like I'd broken some unspoken rule of a game, only he understood. "Sophia," he said, and his voice was exactly what I'd expected, soft, controlled, completely devoid of emotion. "You're not supposed to be here yet." Yet. That single word contained more terror than any scream or threat. It implied planning, timing, a schedule that I'd somehow disrupted by discovering his secret too early. And the way he said my name, like he'd been practicing it, savoring it, made every cell in my body scream with the need to run. But I didn't run. Instead, I looked him directly in those empty, pale eyes and asked the question that had been burning in my mind since I'd seen his wall of horrors. Where are they? Where are the women in those photographs? He tilted his head slightly, studying me with the same clinical interest I'd felt for months. "You're different from the others," he said after a long moment. "Most of them never asked questions. They just screamed." The casual way he spoke about their screaming, like it was a minor inconvenience rather than evidence of unimaginable suffering, made my Portuguese temper flare despite my terror. "What did you do to them?" Instead of answering, he set down the duffel bag and unzipped it slowly, deliberately, like he was revealing a precious gift. Inside were tools I recognized from crime documentaries, things designed to hurt, to control, to silence. And there, nestled among the instruments of torture, was a small digital camera. "I document everything," he said, lifting the camera and turning it over in his hands like a sacred object. Their fear, their final moments, the way they realize no one is coming to save them. It's beautiful in its own way. Pure, honest emotion, stripped of all pretense. He looked at me then with something that might have been curiosity. "You're not crying yet. The others were always crying by now." And that's when I realized something that changed everything. He needed me to be afraid. He fed on terror, on helplessness, on the feeling of absolute control over another human being. But what he didn't expect, what none of his previous victims had given him, was defiance. "You want to know why I'm not crying?" I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Because you made a mistake. You chose the wrong Portuguese woman. Tell me in the comments, do you think defiance was the right choice here? Or should Sophia have tried to run? Because what happened next will challenge everything you think you know about survival." I could see confusion flicker across his pale features, the first real emotion he'd shown since I'd known him. This wasn't how his twisted script was supposed to unfold. His victims were supposed to be helpless, terrified, broken. They weren't supposed to stand tall and challenge him. My grandmother survived the Estado Novo, I continued, taking a small step forward instead of backing away. She lived through dictatorship, through secret police, through neighbors disappearing in the night, never to be seen again. She taught me that there are worse things than death, and one of them is living in fear of cowards who hide in the shadows. Really? His grip tightened on the camera, and I saw something dangerous flash in those empty eyes. I was deviating from his pattern, disrupting the fantasy he'd constructed around my capture and torment. And predators like him, predators who rely on fear and control, don't react well to having their power challenged. "You think your grandmother's stories will save you?" he asked, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Do you think courage matters when you're alone with someone like me?" "I think," I said, reaching slowly into my pocket, "that you've gotten sloppy in your old age. You've been watching me for months, documenting my routines, planning my disappearance. But you missed something crucial." I pulled out my phone, holding it up so he could see the screen. On it was a text message I'd sent to my friend Maria before entering his apartment, along with photographs of his wall of horrors, his address, and a detailed description of him. "I told someone where I was going," I said simply. "I told them about you, about the photographs, about everything, and if I don't check in within the hour, they're calling the police." For the first time since I'd known him, the man from apartment 4B looked genuinely surprised. His methodical planning, his careful observation, his need for absolute control, all of it undermined by a simple precaution he'd never considered his victims capable of taking. But then, his lips curved into something that might have been a smile, and I realized I'd made a terrible miscalculation. "Sophia," he said, setting down the camera and reaching back into his duffel bag, "you really think the police will arrive in time to matter?" What he pulled out next made my blood freeze in my veins. Not a weapon, not a tool of torture, but something far more terrifying. A small, clear vial filled with liquid that looked innocuous as water but carried the weight of absolute finality. "This is how it ends for all of them," he said, holding up the vial so the light caught it. "Peaceful, quiet, no mess to clean up. Within minutes, you'll simply stop. And by the time your friend calls the police, I'll be gone, and you'll be nothing more than another missing person report that gets filed away and forgotten." The clinical way he described my impending death, the matter-of-fact tone he used to discuss erasing my existence, finally broke through the wall of defiance I'd built. My hands started shaking, my breathing became shallow, and for the first time since entering his apartment, I felt the crushing weight of true helplessness. But as he advanced toward me, vial in hand, something else happened, something I never could have predicted. The sound of keys jingling in the hallway, followed by a voice I recognized. "Sophia, are you in there? I saw your door was open." Mrs. Chen. Sweet, observant Mrs. Chen, who made the sign of the cross when she looked at apartment 4B. She was standing in his doorway, and the look on her ancient face when she saw the photographs, the tools, the vial in his hand, was one of pure recognition. "I knew," she whispered in accented English, her eyes never leaving his face. "I knew what you were. I've been waiting for you to make mistake." The man from 4B froze, caught between two women who had disrupted his perfect, controlled world. And in that moment of hesitation, Mrs. Chen did something extraordinary. She pulled out her own phone and showed us both the screen. She'd been recording everything through the open door. Every word, every admission, every piece of evidence was now documented and uploading to the cloud in real time. "Police already coming," she said calmly, as if discussing the weather. "I call them when I hear strange sounds. See girl go into bad man's apartment. They be here soon." And that's when we heard them, sirens in the distance growing louder by the second. The look on his face as those sirens approached was something I'll remember for the rest of my life. Not anger, not fear, but a kind of profound disappointment, like a child whose favorite game had been interrupted just before the best part. He looked at me one last time with those pale, empty eyes, and I saw something there that chilled me more than all his threats and tools combined. Regret, not for what he'd done to those women, not for the lives he'd destroyed, but for the fact that I would never become part of his collection. "You would have been perfect," he said softly, almost sadly. "The fear in your eyes when you finally understood, it would have been beautiful." The sirens were getting closer now, and he knew his time was up. But instead of surrendering, instead of accepting capture, he made one final desperate move. He raised the vial to his own lips. I lunged forward instinctively, knocking it from his hand just as the police crashed through the door. The vial shattered against the wall, its contents mixing with the photographs of his victims in a symbolic destruction of his twisted legacy. What happened next was chaos. Police officers, paramedics, crime scene investigators flooding the small apartment. Questions, statements, the overwhelming machinery of justice finally grinding into motion. But through it all, I couldn't stop thinking about those women on his wall, about how many of them might still be alive if someone had acted sooner, if someone had trusted their instincts about the quiet man in apartment 4B. The investigation that followed uncovered a horror story spanning decades. 17 women across 3 states, all matching his preferred profile, all disappeared without a trace. The man I'd known as my silent neighbor was actually Thomas Brennan, a former medical technician who'd been using his knowledge of anatomy and chemistry to perfect the art of making people vanish. But here's what haunts me most about this whole experience. It wasn't his methods that were so terrifying, or even his victims. It was how perfectly normal he seemed. How easily he blended into the background of everyday life. How he exploited our basic human tendency to mind our own business and not ask uncomfortable questions about the people around us. For those of you watching this who want to know more about cases like this, about the psychology of predators and how to recognize the warning signs before it's too late, consider joining our channel membership. The exclusive content I share there goes deeper into the criminal mind than anything I can post publicly, and it might just save your life or the life of someone you care about. After Thomas Brennan's arrest, I thought the nightmare was over. The police assured me I was safe. The media coverage painted me as a hero who'd helped catch a serial killer. And my friends and family kept telling me how brave I'd been. But they didn't understand that bravery and stupidity often look identical from the outside, and that surviving something like this changes you in ways that never fully heal. The building felt different after that night. Even though Brennan was locked away awaiting trial, even though his apartment was sealed off as evidence, I couldn't shake the feeling that his presence lingered in the walls like smoke. Every sound at night made me jump. Every footstep in the hallway sent adrenaline coursing through my system, and the sight of his apartment door made my skin crawl with remembered terror. But it was the media attention that really broke me down. Reporters camped outside our building for weeks, turning my survival into entertainment, my trauma into headlines. Portuguese woman outsmarts serial killer. Immigrant hero saves lives. They made it sound like a movie script instead of the living nightmare it had been. And their constant questions forced me to relive the worst moments of my life over and over again. The worst part was when they started digging into Brennan's background, uncovering details about his previous victims that I wished I'd never learned. Maria Santos, the first name I'd seen on his wall, had been a nursing student just like I'd been back in Portugal. Elena Vasquez had lived alone in a new city, trying to build a better life for herself. Catherine Murphy had been training for a marathon, just like I'd been when he first started watching me. Each new detail felt like a mirror reflecting what could have been, what should have been, if not for a combination of luck, instinct, and Mrs. Chen's unexpected intervention. Survivor's guilt is a weight that never fully lifts, a constant whisper asking why you deserve to be alive when so many others didn't make it home. 6 months after Brennan's arrest, I made the decision that would define the rest of my life. I couldn't stay in that building, couldn't wake up every morning looking at the door where a monster had lived, couldn't pretend that normal life was possible in a place soaked with so much darkness. I packed everything I owned into boxes and left apartment 3B forever. But here's what I learned in those months of healing, something that changed my entire perspective on life and safety. Predators like Thomas Brennan don't just appear out of nowhere. They're created by a society that values politeness over awareness, that teaches us to ignore red flags in the name of social courtesy, that makes us feel guilty for trusting our instincts when something feels wrong. How many times had I noticed his strange behavior and dismissed it as quirky? How many times had Mrs. Chen or other neighbors felt uncomfortable around him but said nothing because it seemed impolite? How many opportunities had we missed to question, to investigate, to act on the growing pile of evidence that something was seriously wrong? The truth is, we're all complicit when we choose silence over safety, when we decide that minding our own business is more important than protecting each other. And that realization led me to make a promise that I've kept every day since. I would never again ignore my instincts about people who made my skin crawl, and I would never let politeness override my responsibility to speak up when something felt wrong. I need you to make that same promise right now. In the comments, tell me about a time when your gut told you something was wrong about someone, but you ignored it to be polite. Tell me about the neighbor who gave you weird vibes, the co-worker who made your skin crawl, the person who felt dangerous even though you couldn't explain why. Because recognizing those patterns, trusting those instincts, might be the difference between life and death for you or someone you love. Thomas Brennan's trial began 8 months after his arrest, and I was the star witness for the prosecution. Walking into that courtroom, seeing him sitting at the defendant's table in his orange jumpsuit, was like stepping back into the nightmare I'd been trying to escape. But something had changed in him during his time in custody. Those pale, empty eyes that had once held such clinical calculation now seemed almost hollow, like whatever dark fire had driven him for decades had finally burned out, leaving nothing but an empty shell of a man. When I testified about that night in his apartment, about the wall of photographs and his casual admission of murder, he never looked at me, not once. It was as if I no longer existed to him, as if my survival had somehow erased me from his reality entirely. The prosecutor called me a hero. The defense attorney suggested I was an unreliable witness, traumatized by my own imagination, and the media turned every day of testimony into a circus. But all I could think about as I sat in that witness box was the women in those photographs, the ones who hadn't been lucky enough to have a Mrs. Chen listening at their door, the ones whose voices had been silenced forever. When the guilty verdict was read, when Thomas Brennan was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, I expected to feel relief, closure, some sense that justice had been served. Instead, all I felt was empty, hollow, just like his eyes, because no sentence could bring back the women he'd killed, and no verdict could erase the knowledge of what human beings are capable of when they decide other people's lives don't matter. But there was one moment during the sentencing that gave me something resembling peace. When the judge asked if he had anything to say before being taken away, Brennan finally looked at me, and in those pale eyes that had once seemed so empty, I saw something I'd never expected to find there. Fear. Not the clinical, controlled calculation he'd shown in his apartment, but genuine, bone-deep terror at the prospect of spending the rest of his life in a cage, surrounded by other predators who wouldn't be impressed by his methods or intimidated by his reputation. For the first time since I'd known him, Thomas Brennan looked small, vulnerable, human, and I realized that's all he'd ever been, just another scared, broken person who'd chosen to deal with his own pain by inflicting it on others. Evil isn't some supernatural force that possesses people. It's a choice, made over and over again, to value your own desires over other people's right to exist safely in the world. After the trial ended, I made another life-changing decision. I couldn't go back to my old job, couldn't pretend to care about marketing campaigns and quarterly reports when I'd seen what real stakes looked like. Instead, I used the small amount of money I'd saved, combined with some victim compensation funds, to start something new. I became a victims' rights advocate, specializing in cases involving stalking and predatory behavior. Not because I wanted to relive my trauma over and over again, but because I'd learned something valuable that night in apartment 4B. Sometimes the difference between life and death is simply having someone who believes you, someone who takes your fears seriously, someone who's willing to act when others choose to look away. The work isn't easy. Every case brings back memories I'd rather forget. Every client story echoes with familiar themes of isolation, fear, and the terrible realization that the person you trusted was actually hunting you. But it's also given my survival meaning, purpose, a reason to believe that living through that nightmare might actually help other people avoid the same fate. For my channel members, I share detailed case studies of the predators I've helped catch, the warning signs that most people miss, and the techniques that can mean the difference between becoming a victim and staying alive. It's heavy content that will change how you see the world around you, but knowledge that could literally save your life. What I want you to understand, what I need you to carry with you after hearing this story, is that predators like Thomas Brennan are everywhere. They're not movie monsters or obvious villains. They're quiet neighbors, helpful co-workers, charming strangers who know exactly how to blend in until they're ready to strike. But they all share certain traits, certain behaviors that you can learn to recognize if you know what to look for. They study their victims extensively. They violate small boundaries to test reactions. They isolate their targets from support systems. And they always count on society's tendency to mind its own business and avoid uncomfortable confrontations. The reason I'm sharing this story with you, the reason I've relived the worst experience of my life in excruciating detail, is because knowledge is power. The more you understand about how predators operate, the better equipped you are to protect yourself and the people you care about. So I'm going to ask you to do something that might feel uncomfortable. I want you to think about the people in your life right now who make you feel uneasy, who cross small boundaries, who seem to know too much about your schedule or your personal life. I want you to trust those feelings, to take them seriously, to act on them even if it feels impolite or paranoid. Because politeness doesn't protect anyone from predators. Awareness does, action does, and the willingness to speak up when something feels wrong, even when everyone else thinks you're overreacting. 3 years have passed since that night in apartment 4B, and I've built a new life for myself here in New York. I moved to a different neighborhood, one with doormen and security cameras, and neighbors who actually talk to each other. I've learned to sleep through the night again, most of the time. I've even started dating, though I screen potential partners with the thoroughness of a federal background investigator. But some changes are permanent. I'll never again live somewhere without multiple exit routes. I'll never ignore my instincts about people who feel wrong. And I'll never take for granted the simple luxury of feeling safe in my own home. The building where Thomas Brennan lived was demolished last year, replaced by a shiny new development with twice as many units and half as much character. Sometimes I wonder if the new residents know about the horrors that happened there, if they can feel the echo of what those walls witnessed. Probably not. Most people prefer not to think about such things, prefer to believe that evil is rare and obvious and easily avoided. But I know better now. I've seen how thin the line is between safety and nightmare, how quickly a normal life can become a fight for survival. And I've learned that the price of ignoring that reality is measured in lives lost, in women who never made it home, in families who still wonder what happened to their daughters, sisters, mothers. Mrs. Chen still lives in the old building that wasn't demolished, and we meet for coffee every few months. She never talks about that night directly, never discusses the role she played in saving my life, but sometimes she looks at me with those ancient eyes and nods, and I know she's satisfied with the outcome of her vigilant watching. She taught me something important that night, that being a good neighbor isn't about minding your own business. It's about paying attention, about caring enough to act when someone needs help, about being willing to insert yourself into dangerous situations if it means preventing greater harm. The work I do now has put me in contact with dozens of survivors, men and women, who've escaped from predators, who've lived to tell their stories and help others recognize the warning signs. Each case teaches me something new about human evil and human resilience, about the 1,000 small choices that determine whether someone lives or dies. But the most important lesson I've learned is this. Survival isn't just about the moment of crisis, the split-second decisions that determine immediate outcome. True survival is about what you do afterward, how you choose to live with the knowledge of what humans are capable of, how you transform trauma into purpose and terror into strength. Some people would say I should have moved away from New York after what happened, should have gone back to Portugal, where life felt safer and more predictable. But I realized that running away wouldn't change what I'd learned about predators, wouldn't protect other women from men like Thomas Brennan, wouldn't honor the memory of those 17 victims whose photographs covered his walls. Instead, I chose to stay and fight, to use my survival as a weapon against the darkness, to turn my nightmare into other people's warning system. And every time I help someone recognize the signs of stalking, every time I convince a potential victim to trust their instincts and take action, I feel like those women from his wall are working through me, their silenced voices finally finding a way to save lives. For those of you who've made it this far, who've listened to every detail of this horror story, I have one final request. Don't let this just be entertainment for you. Don't file it away as another true crime story to discuss at parties. Take it seriously. Use it. Let it change how you interact with the world around you. Pay attention to your neighbors. Trust your instincts about people who feel wrong. Speak up when you see signs of predatory behavior, and never, ever dismiss someone's fears as overreaction or paranoia. Because the next person who needs help might be someone you care about, and your willingness to act could be the difference between them living or becoming another photograph on another monster's wall. The man from apartment 4B is gone, locked away where he can never hurt anyone again. But there are others like him out there, studying their victims, planning their attacks, counting on your politeness and indifference to give them the cover they need to strike. Don't give them that cover. Be vigilant. Be brave. Be the person who notices when something's wrong and does something about it. Be the Mrs. Chen in someone else's story. Because in the end, that's how we defeat monsters like Thomas Brennan, not by hiding from them or pretending they don't exist, but by refusing to give them the shadows they need to hunt in. By building communities where people watch out for each other, where strange behavior gets questioned, where predators can't blend in and plan their attacks in peace. The choice is yours. You can close this video and go back to your normal life, treating this as just another disturbing story you heard online. Or you can let it change you, empower you, turn you into someone who makes the world a little bit safer for everyone else. I know which choice I made. The question is, what choice will you make? Remember, evil thrives in silence and shadow. But awareness, action, and the courage to speak up when something feels wrong, those are the lights that drive the darkness away. Stay vigilant, stay safe. And never ignore the voice in your gut that tells you when something isn't right. That voice might just save your life.